even if you do the right thing, the right act can have irreparably bad consequences or aspects. And I'll just tell you, it'll only take a couple of sentences. A story he told me, which was one he knew from personal experience in the Second World War, which sort of illustrates this. In the Second World War, he said, a government minister appeared in Britain before his staff, in particular before his kind of the people who typed his, I think about 20 of them, said, I'm going to do something which is terribly unjust. I'm going to fire you all. And I'm going to fire you because there's a leak from this department. We have reason to believe there's a leak from this department going to the enemy somehow. And as a result of that, brave men and women are dying in terrible circumstances, being tortured to death and God knows what. He said, but it's a terribly wrong thing I'm doing. And I want you to think about it. If you think about 5 minutes, it was in one sense. Because not one of them, I mean, only one of them was guilty out of the 20, but didn't know which one it was. And all the rest would have their lives permanently ruined. It wasn't just not having that job. They'd never get another job in anything sensitive or anything important, except it was ruining their entire lives. But I'm going to do it because I think it's the right thing to do, because it's part of the war effort, but also it's unfair to these other people who are being, if we don't do it. So in other words, there's a sort of ultimate conflict of ethical values here. Now, one way you can sort of resolve this, which is a kind of way that some people would now say, well, that's all nonsense. You just calculate what's the best outcome, Jeremy Bentham or something like this, Utilitarianism, then you needn't regret it. He shouldn't have come in and said, I'm about to do the right thing. I mean, this has actually been said to me, and this I find absurd too, by the way, in a Monty Pythonish way. They say, well, you should have just got up and said, I'm going to do the right thing, and you're going to be fired. And some of you, of course, will have ruined lives, but there we are. You know, it's all part of the better. You know, I'm sure this is the right thing. Well, I think one of the reasons, back to a conversation we had earlier about virtue ethics, is kind of rather queer, is that someone who could do that who could actually ruin the lives even of 19 out of the 20 people, let's say there were exactly 20, without feeling any kind of flicker of contrition or remorse, would be a moral monster. We wouldn't want people like that running our affairs or something. So someone who can see that there is a terrible injustice involved, but who doesn't want to wash their hands and say, well, I'll just resign, someone else will resolve it. Or doesn't want to stick to some really Pelagian-like rule and say, you should never punish people who are innocent, because you would know, the one thing you would know is that 19 of this, or nearly all of them, were innocent. You should never do it. So I just won't do it, whatever the consequences. Someone who's more morally, I would say, adult than that, and who's concerned about it, knew what it would mean if we'd lost that particular war, and knew even apart from losing the war, what it meant for people to be parachuted down and tortured to death and perish in various terrible ways and so on. Wouldn't just say, well, I'm sticking to the rule. They would be faced with precisely this tragic dilemma, if you like. And I think tragic in the sense of dilemmas which can't be decided in ways in which there is no irreparable loss. Yeah, exactly. I think they're quite recurrent in ethical life and don't just happen in the middle of terrible wars. I think they happen actually, not all the time, fortunately, but they're recurrent. And I would say they're part of the human territory. So if you want to sort of, it's a bit like getting rid of death. If you want to sort of eliminate them from human experience, maybe we could sort of clone people who didn't have these dilemmas. Maybe we could produce these moral monsters. People would just go around maximizing things. Although I think, you know, the whole Benthamite and utilitarian, it's sort of coming back now, by the way, with the gross national happiness. You've heard about that as part of this wonderful new regime we're living in. I think the whole thing presupposes the kind of exactitude which is not achievable, a kind of exactitude. We can't tot up. You know, if we could tot up all the headaches in the world and add them up in some and say, if we just performed 2 or 3 terrible experiments on human beings or sentient animals, we'd get rid of all these minor headaches. That would be an improvement. And that must be an improvement if you accept some kinds of utility. I mean, it's completely ridiculous. Even if it was, I would confidently reject it. I don't want a world free of minor headaches if that's what it's going to cost. I think you're entirely right that the tendency of secular thinking, nearly all of it, not all, Freud's different, for example, so was Berlin, but and he was a secular thinker, but the tendency is to repress tragedy the way death is repressed, because it's something sort of can't cope with, can't get round, can't circumvent. It marks the limit of human will. You can deny that it exists. You can say, well, there isn't tragedy. It just shows we've miscalculated. You know, that's all tragedy is. It's an error of calculation.
Yes.
Yeah. Or you can deny that there is death, or you can say that somehow Kurzweil or cryonic suspension or whatever will get us around. But that's really a denial, I think, of enduring features of human life, enduring features, which, as you've pointed out, I mean, it's not just that they're enduring, they are part of what gives human lives the meaning that they do have. And if you take them away, you can't take them away anyway. I mean, that's, if you want a bit of optimism in what I'm saying, all these ideas of taking away these things are completely absurd. I mean, this kind of world of moral monsters who don't feel things, who don't die, who calculate things correctly, it's never going to come about, so we needn't fear it. One can perhaps reasonably fear attempts to bring it about, because they are normally disastrous. But that type of world is just not ever going to come into being. And this is where Augustine was right, and where the Buddha was right, and where all religious thinkers who say this, in a sense, something fundamentally contradictory in human beings, some kind of fundamental. I mean, that I see as a reason for permanent optimism, actually, because none of these horrible ideas of transcending our humanity and becoming something different will ever come about.